and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast. And today you are in for such a treat because earlier on I was joined by Mike Murphy, who leads a project called the EV Politics Project. Now, what I'm about to say next, I think, reflects the political nature of the EV discourse at this current moment in time, because when I learned that Mike was joining us on the podcast, I was surprised. And I was surprised because I had learnt that he is one of the Republican Party's most successful political media consultants, which is surprising because, as we know, to date, EVs are political hot potatoes. They don't always sit that favourably, and particularly so with Republican voters, not least thanks to various comments made by a certain Donald Trump, including one which he made late last year where he wished electric car supporters to rot in hell on a Truth Social post. But Mike has handled strategy and advertising for more than 26 successful gubernatorial, that's governor for those in the UK, and senatorial campaigns, including for Senator John McCain, Mitt Romney, Jeb Bush, Arnold Schwarzenegger, to name just a few. And in 2020, he served as a key strategist for Republican voters against Trump. But importantly for this audience, he's also a very proud VW ID4 driver. But in his work for the EV Politics Project, it is a bipartisan effort to better understand the growing divide between Republicans and Democrats over electric vehicle adoption. And through this initiative, he is hoping to put an end to, and this is a quote for those listening, partisan political bickering so America can lead the world in electric vehicles. My goodness me, we had an awful lot of ground to cover, so we will be straight into it after this little tiny advert break. Love everything electric? Then join us live in Canada this September, the South in October, and Australia and London in 2025. Okay, so I'm just gonna have a little caveat to our audience. I really want to make sure that I don't get any of this wrong. So normally I try to do this without notes, but if you see me looking down, it's because I have my notes in in my hand. Okay, so I want to mention for those listening in the future that we're currently having this conversation at the end of July 2024. Elon Musk has just donated to former President Donald Trump's campaign. Kamala Harris hasn't yet announced her running mate. And we're about 10 days past the point where Joe Biden has just announced that he will not be running for the next presidential candidate. So, goodness me, it is an exceptionally heated time, I think it's fair to say. And the other caveat that we have to say is that here in the UK, it is 31 degrees. I think it is absolutely sweltering. The door is open. If you hear the great outdoors, that is why I couldn't cope with the door shut. So apologies for that. Okay, so Mike, you are here chatting to us in the capacity of founder of the EV Politics Project. And I wonder if you could just give us sort of the headline pitch. What is it? Why did you set it up? What are you trying to do?
Well, one, it's wonderful to be here with you. Thanks for having me on. I set this thing up at the end of last year out of frustration. I'm a Republican political consultant. I've been a leader in the anti-Trump movement forever, so I had a little time on my hands. I'm not doing a lot of Republican candidate work, but I saw a lot of conservatives in my party, and I'm a conservative, out of Washington really ignorantly bashing EVs, and it irritated me. I grew up in Detroit, familiar with the auto industry, care a lot about North American manufacturing jobs. I have to confess that historically, my lifetime average is probably 6 miles per gallon. I like cars. I like working on them. But I became a nut for EVs. I live in California, in Los Angeles, about 3 years ago. The elegance of the electric motor, the instant torque, I like driving them. And so I could see there, in many ways, the future of transportation. And I didn't like all the mindless bashing. So I started evpolitics.org, and I looked at it like a political campaign, which is what I've done for a long time. So we took a poll. And we took a look at all the EV perceptions, but unlike the market research, which is common in the industry, we broke it out by political identity, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, et cetera, et cetera. And we learned a ton. And again, coming from the not bashful world of national campaign consulting, I immediately flacked the data we had, which was very different than any other data, into the trade press, automotive news, a few of the YouTube channels for EV enthusiasts. And that was then picked up by the Washington Post, blah, blah, blah. And then the auto companies started calling me, which was my agenda because I wanted to infect their marketing a little with better messaging. So that was kind of the genesis of the whole thing. And it's taken off, I'm happy to say.
It is truly astonishing. And I've read the research report. And I want to go into some of the details. So actually, before we do, I want to ask one question before we get there, because you said Republican and conservatives, and we have a really, really international audience. And I want to just sort of ask you if you can paint the difference between the two. Are they mutually exclusive? What's the Venn diagram look like between those two terms?
Well, they're highly correlated. I mean, I know in a lot of places you kind of have a conservative party or liberal or labor, depending. And I've worked around the world in politics a bit. But we look at both the spectrum of party identification, Republican or Democrat, and then ideological perspective. And there is a little cross-pollination. There are some Democrats who say they're more conservative, et cetera. But basically, they align together. The real schism in American politics right now is flavor of conservatism, the traditional small government, internationalist conservatism of like a George Herbert Walker Bush. Traditionally, that was the Republican Party I came up in. Or the populist conservatism of a Donald Trump, which you can really trace back to populist rural Democrats back in the 40s and 50s, the Huey Longs, the George Wallaces in the 60s. So the Republican Party has kind of undergone this fracture into being dominated by the populist conservative wing, which feels a lot more like Juan Perón half the time than it does like the party I came up in. But what we found in the U.S., which is a bit different than anywhere else, where we're unique, some would say a little strange, is that electric vehicles have been defined now by political identity. And that's very bad news for EVs in the U.S. Our survey was of American voters across the country, but we only survey people with a household income of $50,000 a year or more because we wanted to overlap with the entire new car market. A lot of used car market there too, but we wanted new car buyers to have it be relevant to the industry. And we found a massive polarization in opinion of electric vehicles by party. If you're a Democrat, you like them. If you're a Republican, you're much more skeptical. Because here they become two things have happened. The early marketing on EVs was very much pitched as an environmental virtue signal. That we had the famous, and it might have run globally, Nissan with the Leaf had the white polar bear ad where the polar bear was watching the melting ice flows. It was very creative. And it made an arduous journey to suburban America where it hugged a guy who just bought a Leaf. The problem is we do not have political consensus in America on climate change. That might sound crazy, but we asked people on our survey, do you think climate change is a serious problem we have to address right away? And this represents about 2/3 of the American presidential election, our group. A serious problem we have to address right away, or is it something that's not that big a deal and has been really overhyped by the media? And that split was about 58-40. So you had 40% saying climate change is not a big deal. And so when you marketed the vehicles with the little green leaf on the literal leaf and they became environmental, it was to use a phrase the kids use now, it was a triggering a thing to a lot of partisan populist Republicans. Now, you may say that's stone cold crazy, but if your job is EV adoption in the U.S., you don't really want to alienate 40% of the new car market, which, by the way, is among the parties, Republicans are the largest plurality. 40%, Democrats are 36% of the market, independent, non-party registered voters are the remainder. So the environmental thing became a thing. And then because our politics are so hopelessly polarized now, it's all I'm right, you're evil. The Democrats seen as adopting EVs, it became an off-putting thing to Republicans. So now the products are sucked into this chainsaw fight of politics we're having. And a lot of our mission is to try to understand that and undo it to help the companies get an EV adoption across the board. Our President Joe Biden has announced very ambitious goals by 2032 of 50% electric vehicle sales. And that number is mathematically impossible to get to unless the Republican segment of the market starts to adopt EVs, just that marketplace decision. So anyway, we're deeply in that whole space.
And it's so interesting seeing just like how tribal this whole debate is. And in fact, even some of the terminology, things like Biden's EVs are a bad idea. And yet, as you say, if this is going to be a successful policy, it needs people from across the political spectrum to buy EVs, which ultimately is good for the car industry and for their markets. And there are so many different components to that. But I want to zoom out for a second, because as much as the survey that you conducted really, really pointed out the differences between Republicans and Democrat beliefs towards EVs and the environment, there was also quite a lot of common ground. I wonder if you could share some of those.
Yeah, that was the most interesting thing in the data. We asked people, what do you like most about EVs? What's the best thing about them? Not just EV drivers, but everybody. And Republicans and Democrats looked identical. The number one thing for both was not paying for gas anymore, petrol. Number two was fast, fun to drive. It was good for the environment was the 40-point difference. So the environmental thing, which was an early selling point of EVs, is actually a problem now. And I joke, I briefed a lot of the environmental groups in D.C., and they don't really like hearing this. This is all mission critical to them. They want to win the war over emissions. And I said, well, that's your outcome. That doesn't mean you need converts. You don't need Bubba in Alabama in his pickup truck to have a Save the Whales sticker next to the National Rifle Association sticker. You want them to drive an EV because they hate paying for gas and it's fast and, it has use case for them, and take the outcome of no CO2 emission. You don't need converts. You need outcomes. You need more cars sold. I, again, grew up around the car business, and when a 79-year-old balding guy walks into the Chevrolet dealership and says, I want a new Corvette, the salesman is going to say, you're kidding me, you old freak. What are you trying to do here? No, you say, we got a beautiful one right here. Why don't you fill out a credit app? We can do this deal today. You move the unit. And that's where my theory is that some of the car execs, particularly based abroad, be it in Asia or Europe, look at their domestic politics and think there's more or less consensus on climate change here. Now, there are policy arguments and everything, but it's not a big war. So if we put the green leaf on the car and we run the environmental ads and everything, it's a hit. We've solved climate change. Put that in our American market too. But here, it's an iceberg. So what is much better, we know from our data, is sell the vehicles on their attributes. Less maintenance, no gasoline, fast, fun to drive. The main thing that people, both parties look very much the same, worry about, of course, is range perception and worries about how do you charge it and everything. And a particular problem we have here is not so much highway charging where we're behind, but it's rapidly getting better. I just drove an electric VW, an ID4 from Los Angeles to New Hampshire, 3,000 miles across America. The second time I've done it, because we're in New Hampshire for the summer. And I have to admit that charging, with one exception, was flawless all the way across the U.S. So the real worry is multifamily. If you're a young professional outside Chicago or San Francisco or Dallas or Miami, you're very likely not in a single family house. You're in a condominium or an apartment building, a nice one. You're paying a lot of rent, or you've got $1.5 million US condo. You've got a good income. You want to buy an EV, but you have no way to charge it overnight in the garage. So you're forced into very crowded fast chargers in urban areas where there's going to be a wait, and it's very inconvenient. So it's the multifamily unit charging problem is really and it's all over our polling data. So anyway, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but fundamentally, if you take the environmental virtue signaling out of it, the products do really well. I always point people to this. One of the best marketers of electric vehicles, the real lesson teacher, I think, for industry, is a company called Polaris here in the U.S. They sell four-wheel drive all-terrain vehicles that a lot of hunters use. They look like kind of big powered four-wheel tricycles. They're expensive. You can easily spend $40,000 on one. They have an electric model called the Kinetic. They don't call it the electric. It has a waiting list. They cannot build them fast enough. And they sell into red states that are the most EV negative in our polling. But they don't market them on you are one with the trees, silent, electric, no pollution. They say when you want to sneak up on your prey, kill it with your bare hands, not waste a bullet, use the silent, deadly kinetic. And they can't make them quick enough because they're taking the product attributes where the marketplace is. And that means no value judgment, which is hard for advocacy groups to do. They'd really like everybody to say, I want a green vehicle to save the planet. But if you go where the customers are, you sell more product, and the product sale is your huge policy victory down the road. And that is a lesson I think the companies have learned and are adapting to. The environmental movement's having a hard time learning that. It's kind of like, going to church and saying the key is to tell people they don't have to show up at mass. I get why that's a hard thing to sell. But our goal is to help the companies get much more successful marketing communication to conservatives. And the other reason we're in it, and there are other groups in Washington that care a lot about this, is I don't want to lose the North American industrial base to China. It is quite possible that China will manufacture 85% of the world's automobiles in another 20 years. And it was the United Auto Workers and the auto industry that got my family into the middle class in Detroit, Michigan. And I don't want to see those plants go away. And so for a national security reason and just for manufacturing is an important part of the economy. So we've got to get our domestic market to be a success for EVs. So the companies, either the Detroit companies or our allies, be it Jaguar Land Rover, Volkswagen, Hyundai, Toyota across the world that manufacture in the U.S. or our close allies, Canada and Mexico, which is kind of the economic unit in the auto industry here, North American manufacturing. That chain goes across borders. They prosper. That's good for democracy. It's not like the 70s where the Japanese companies invaded a complacent Detroit, because Japan's an ally. China's a rival, not necessarily an ally. And of course, they're massively subsidizing their industry. And so we have to recognize that, and we have to have a strategy for it. And American EV adoption should be the core.
There's some really interesting things there, and not least the one about hunting, which I have to say I experienced firsthand. We were meeting an organization who have an electric mining truck and a copper mine, and we were talking about electrification.
Sure.
And this guy, he pulled out his phone and said, yeah, I love my electric bike because look at all of the things that I've hunted. And then started
right.
showing me pictures. And I was like, I really don't want to see that, but also good for you. Also good for the
yeah, well done. Well, we should always remember the founder of General Motors, which for a long time was the world's biggest and most successful car company with Vauxhall in the UK. Alfred P. Sloan, had a slogan, which was, we shall manufacture a car for every purse and purpose. Go where the customers are.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And we recently filmed an episode with an organization called Lightship, who are based in Denver, Colorado. And the founder, he said exactly that. He said, you've got to meet consumers where they're at. And there are one in 10 households own an electric RV. They sell 600,000 a year. You've got to make them super, super compelling at a price point that's also super compelling, irrespective of, again, the environmental credentials. And this point about the environment is something that I want to explore a little bit further. But you started talking about the impact of, the Inflation Reduction Act and how many jobs that's actually stimulated in really important swing states. And that's where I think I start to get a little bit confused, because on the one hand, if the US says, no, we do not want any electric vehicles, or rather if certain people like Donald Trump say, we do not want electric vehicles, then that's, handing an own goal it's an own goal and handing the market over to China to say, well, fantastic, we'll swoop in and take that electric vehicle market share. When actually there's this huge opportunity to stimulate tens of thousands of jobs across the US and actually really contribute to, the future of energy security, not least because, as we know, electric vehicles by their very nature are much more circular. They keep those resources within an economy.
Right.
And it just feels like those two things are totally at odds with each other. This very, very anti-EV rhetoric at the same time as this huge opportunity to stimulate manufacturing jobs within very politically important swing states. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
that's true. A lot of the Trump stuff doesn't hold up to logic because I don't think Donald Trump wakes up in the morning and dives into the briefing book. He's totally instinctual, and often he doesn't know what he's talking about, to be blunt about it. So the problem is, first of all, I'm a free market conservative. I don't like subsidies. But before 2021, the People's Republic of China was outspending the United States 7-1 on EV subsidies. It was very easy to get the government to build you a $2 billion EV manufacturing plant. And many of them went bankrupt. But it was government policy to build that huge capacity. And now they've got it and they're trying to export. The trade negotiating phrase is dump EVs at less than real market cost to go conquest other markets. There's a good story in the New York Times a few days ago about how they basically invaded the Taiwanese market, which had indigenous car manufacturing. And they've really put a hurt on the Asian brands there. So what Trump says is EVs are terrible. Now, Trump used to own a Tesla Roadster, by the way. I don't know if he ever drove it, but that's one of the many ironies here. Excuse me. So his argument is BYD is building a factory, the largest, most successful, and in a rare case, profitable Chinese EV brand in Mexico. They're actually building them around the world. And they're going to come up and kill all the jobs. Well, the answer is, okay, we better be ready to compete, which is, the North America, because the American market is not the largest. We're about 10% of the world car market, but we're the most profitable by far. This is where the money is made. Europe too, but it's key real estate. So we got to be able to compete. The real threat, and this is what has hurt the Taiwanese, has happened in the Israeli car market, is if you let the domestically manufactured Chinese autos export at a massive level, and we have tariffs in place, and I'm an anti-tariff guy, but in the short term, I think it's necessary. Chinese auto worker makes $9 an hour. So that labor cost versus an American unionized auto workers at about $90 an hour, the non-unionized Tesla, some of the North American makers that aren't unionized might be 65 to 70 an hour. You can't compete. And I have environmental friends who say, well, this will be good. The Chinese will flood the market with $23,000 EVs. Well, it'll be good for consumers who want a subsidized EV. It will not be good for all the closed down factories in the U.S. and people put out of work. So we have to compete at the lower price end with American or Western European or even Mexican labor cost. So Trump's argument is we got to keep them out because they're bad, and the Chinese are going to wipe us out if EVs come. Well, EVs are coming as the use cases win out in the end and pricing wins out in the end. The question is, are we going to help our North American manufacturers be able to compete? And I don't think Trump gets it, because he can't really put two and two together on this. Now, as far as the subsidies, there's a lot to criticize in what they've done because the execution has been bumpy. But fundamentally, they're the right thing and they're necessary. And, we're finally starting to see the way like the charging network was done was the money was given to the state. So you took the problem of pushing out a bunch of federal money and you made it 50 times worse because some states are really good at it. I'll plug Governor Mike DeWine, a Republican, non-Trump Republican in Ohio, old school meat and potatoes Republican. He opened the first charging stations in the country. I used one driving the car from Los Angeles to here. It was magnificent. Many of the states, including California, have yet to open a single station in a program of $7 billion in federal money because there are 18 layers of bureaucracy. And if you don't have enough left-handed screwdriver operators and you're not in a community of economic pain, one of the best arguments against socialism is show what happens when you give them $7 billion to build EV charging stations, and 3 years later, they haven't figured out how to build one yet. So we have problems. But fundamentally, those subsidies are critical because the competitor, the hostile competitor, not a political ally, China, is massively subsidizing. So we don't have a lot of choice other than surrendering the future of the auto industry to the Chinese, which I don't think is very good for America. And I don't think most Americans think that.
And so the subsidies offered via the Inflation Reduction Act, had they been really seamlessly executed and deployed, safe to say that's a very necessary and vital thing to stimulate the industry to remain competitive with China, and that those tariffs, I think it's 102.5% tariffs on Chinese EVs, again, you
Right.
need those to kind of level the playing field and, again,
Yeah.
protect
What the
them.
American auto CEOs say, and I think the Western Europeans would say too, is give us about 30 months so we can get a $27,000 mass EV into the market and let the charging networks catch up, particularly this multifamily problem. There's billions of federal money to retrofit apartment buildings. Again, I'm skeptical about how good they're going to be at executing it, but give us that 30 months catch-up period, and then we got to compete. And, the Stellantis CEO, a global company, but is like, he's even more hostile on the tariffs because he says we got to be able to compete worldwide. And, he's looking at his European brands. But I don't think there's a single auto CEO that think tariffs are the long-term answer. They've got to find product that can do it. But there has to be a tariff answer to dumping, which is the government decides we're going to pay a lot of people to make EVs at a loss, and then we're going to ship them to foreign markets to conquest those markets for market share. And it's basically the equivalent of putting a piranha in a koi pond, and it's just going to eat all the goldfish. It's an artificial market, and we've had that problem in steel and other industries. So there has to be some anti-dumping protectionism if that becomes the policy of a powerful economic competitor. But we got to be able to compete, and we got to be able to compete on price. And that's what, Jim Farley at Ford is a great leader in the EV space, and he totally gets it. And Ford's got, actually in California, Skunk Works, a lot of former Tesla and Rivian people are doing exactly that, trying to build that competitive car. GM has the new Bolt coming out. Volkswagen, a company that's invested a lot in U.S. manufacturing. BMW, premium brand, they can charge a little more, but everybody is racing for EV cost parity and beyond. And I think given time they will, and the products will be good.
It's really interesting because on the one hand, just sort of coming back to the subsidy point, that there's a huge amount of money that's available for obviously charging stations, ensuring that infrastructure exists, for ensuring that car companies can switch over their plants to electric vehicles, to enable the broader supply chain. Really, really good to stimulate that industry. On the other hand, there are subsidies for people available via that tax credit, the $7,500 for a brand new EV. And it feels like they have annoyed different groups and been well received by different groups for different reasons. On the one hand, fantastic for jobs at this end of the spectrum. On the other hand, it's felt that those incentives are a form of political coercion, of forcing, and I'm doing quotation marks for those listening, but Biden's EVs on people that don't necessarily want them. They don't want to have that environmental signaling, but also that they're going potentially to the wrong people. They're going to the affluent people on the West Coast or in coastal regions. And that's not necessarily a good thing either. So with the benefit of hindsight, how would you have approached that from a strategic perspective, perhaps?
Well, that's a great question, because there's kind of a cloud of these arguments. Some have more valid than other. It is true that EVs have first invaded the upper end markets in price. And okay, it's a free country. I agree that the cheaper they become, the more people are going to buy them. So I think the industry spends a lot of time thinking, how can we build a $28,000 EV that's profitable? I think the free market system will get there. On the subsidies, it's interesting. The refiners lobby in particular, which is spending a lot of money right now on television ads trashing EVs, has pushed among think tanks in Washington that are happy to take a contribution this argument that the subsidies are bad and anti-Republican. Now, they take it out of context. They don't explain we're in a competition with Chinese subsidies. But we actually polled on that. And among rank and file Republicans, not Washington influence industry for hire think tanks, Republicans like the subsidy slightly more than Democrats do, because we're a greedy bunch and we are perfectly happy to take $7,000 back from the government. So out in voter world, the subsidies are pretty popular. The biggest problem is not enough people know about them. And that's where the retail dealers have to do a better job of, come on in, Uncle Sam has a check for you. But that's happening. So it's a myth that rank and file Republicans don't like subsidies. The argument that resonates the most from that world is that there's a mandate coming where we're going to outlaw gas cars, big government, Joe Biden, and this is what the refiner TV ads say, are going to outlaw gasoline cars. It's really an argument based on the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal authorities' mileage standards, which are a way they coerce the industry into building more fuel-efficient cars. And by raising those mileage standards, they force them to sell more electrics because that helps the overall average of miles per gallon. But it's not quite a mandate. It is pressure forward, but they create this thing in the public of Big Brother's going to take away your pickup truck, your ICE vehicle. Now, California, which sets its own policy, is saying new cars, not used. I'll still be able to go buy my Dodge Hemi, and I probably will, used in California, but by 2035, I believe it is, they want to, the CARB regulations say we can't sell new ICE vehicles in California. And so that's kind of the bugaboo regulation. California has a history of clean air problems, and so the regulators there are very aggressive, and some other states say we're going to follow California. The problem with that is I don't believe, as a political consultant, I ran Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's campaign, so I have a lot of experience there. I don't believe that those regulations are going to survive the next gubernatorial election in California because no rank and file Californian knows about them. And like a lot of regulatory stuff, once it gets out of the regulatory high-fiving back room of we finally passed the regulations, and candidates running for office have to take a position, and they're all going to say, oh, that's crazy. We're going to slow that down, and there'll be a new car board and a change. But it has been an effective bugaboo, the idea that Big Brother is going to take your ICE car away. So my advice to the industry and the movement has been, there's a lot of enthusiasm in the environmental movement among those regulations, but I would not bet the franchise, so to speak, that they're all going to hold up. Because if the voters don't want them in our democracy, things get changed. And Americans hate bans. Right now, the Republican Party is taking a bit of a beating because the Supreme Court decided, why don't we ban some abortions? Well, Americans don't like bans. We don't like banning guns. We don't like banning abortions. And we sure don't like banning cars that have an engine people like. So my argument is the path to success here is the use case of electric vehicles. In the polling, we asked people, do you have friends or relatives who own an EV? If they said yes to that question, on every measure of their opinion, even though they don't own an EV, EVs ranked a lot higher. EVs are seductive. If you drive one for a weekend and get over the charging fear, in most cases, unless you're towing a horse trailer through North Dakota, you're going to like the EV better. You're going to like saving $1,000 to $2,000 a year in gasoline. You're going to like not going to the transmission shop. So we can win the market battle here. If we win the market battle and create millions more of EV drivers, we will then win the political battle. But hoping that a small group of regulators can force people into a product choice as big as important to folks is in the financial commitment of a new car, I think is a fool's errand. So if we're successful, that argument of the mandates will go away. We'll just win the battle of choosing, which is, once again, back to the attributes.
And it's so critical when you think about a car generally. On the one hand, it is a deeply practical item. It gets you from A to B. You need it to go to work oftentimes or to get where you need to go sensibly. But it's also a deeply irrational purchase where you can have preferences on, particular trim for no other reason other than, because I just like it better that way. And I think it's human nature. We don't like being told what to do.
Oh, yeah. Cars have a fashion element to them. I came back and told my wife, hey, I might get a Ford Mach-E Mustang. And she looked at me and said, you're way too old for that. What are you thinking, you knucklehead? And, the last car was a Porsche. So I thought, honey, you've already lost that battle. She drives a Range Rover, by the way. She's a left winger, and I can't get her electric, but the glacier is melting. So, yes, people buy cars for practical reasons, you put it well, and they're making a statement about themselves. Otherwise, all cars would come in white and black. There's a reason there are colors and interiors and designer editions and ridiculous things like the Cybertruck. People like to make a statement with automobiles. And that's become a problem in EVs because the statement became dogma and virtue signaling when it ought to be, hey, I've never seen a transmission shop in my life.
And that's a perfect segue, because I want to get back to this point about the environment, because as you say, if we look at jobs, we look at the practicality, we look at the cost of EV ownership, they make a tremendous amount of sense. And yet there's a huge marketing effort of how some of those incentives are communicated, how the narrative is shifted away from the environmental credentials towards, well, what are the outcomes for you personally as an individual that you will feel in your pocket? But it's also true that this whole idea that the environment is this hugely partisan topic didn't always used to be the case. It seems to be
No,
something
weirdly
that's,
enough, it was a Republican president, Richard Nixon, now disgraced, but still he founded the Environmental Protection Agency. It used to be conservationism, going back to Teddy Roosevelt, one of the great original Republicans. But it has become, like everything in our politics, a fracture point. Part of it is the environmental movement took on a bit of the branding of almost a religion. There was a zealotry to it. And that was embraced by the progressive element of the Democratic Party. And so it became, well, therefore we're against it. You know, the tribalism took over. And there is an anti-science bias in the populist wing of the Republican Party, and that's kind of taken hold too. You know, the problem with tribalism is it becomes very binary. If they're for it, we're against it. Hatfield McCoy, you know, and so people don't have to think anymore. They just follow the tribal drumbeat, and that's a problem. It's cheapened our politics here quite a bit.
and there's definitely some suggestion. And I was reading various articles in preparation for this discussion, and the youth-led Sunrise Movement, they had a protest earlier this week where they were chanting, "Vance is a liar, our planet is on fire," and billionaires own Vance. And he's an interesting person. So this is obviously for those who are unaware that he is Donald Trump's running partner. And his personal views, if you really sort of trace them back through history, have changed. And they seem to change depending on who may be funding or not funding his campaign. And I think, you know, even more obviously, Donald Trump said very brazenly that he would get rid of the EV mandate. Again, there are quotations there for any oil and gas executive that gave him $1 billion towards his campaign. So on the one hand, I think it seems as an observer to US politics that the environment is very easy to make this tribalist issue because it requires some sort of change of behavior. And as we've already said, people don't like being told what to do. People inherently don't really like change. But also, there's a huge financial component and there's a huge vested interest, particularly from oil and gas companies, for there not to be an environmental agenda. So what is the real root and the real kernel to this issue, and how do we combat it?
Well, just about J.D. Vance, I know J.D. Vance. He called me up in 2017 after he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, and he wanted to run for Senate in Ohio as an anti-Trump Republican and wanted to strategize a campaign. So I like that, J.D. Vance. I don't think he's motivated by money. I think he's motivated by ambition. And it's not uncommon in politics to people who decide, I'll be what I have to be to move ahead. And I think he's a tragic version of that sad and enduring parable. As far as money in politics, it's true, but any incumbent interest group will want to protect its position politically. That's true of big oil companies, particularly the refiners, by the way. A lot of the oil majors, and BP's been a leader in this, and I know, believe me, there is a narcissism to parts of the environmental movement where they think they're moving their ball forward by chanting the planet's on fire. And people look around and say, no, the planet's not on fire. What are you screaming about? And then let's go deface a museum art piece or something in the name of the environment. And that is such a gift to people who oppose environmental progress, the radicalism. You never move people with radicalism. It's narcissism. They can all high-five each other, and boys can meet girls, and we're all young radicals, and it's very chic, and get out the Che Guevara T-shirts. But as a practical politician, I'll tell you, it's counterproductive. That said, incumbent economic forces protect themselves, whether or not it's big oil. In the case of EVs, it's really the refining gasoline industry. Though I'll tell you, it's interesting. I was invited to speak to the Transportation Electrification Institute, which is basically a group of people who are in the fueling business, which means they own the large service stations on the highways. Circle K, 7-Eleven. Those are the dominant brands here. Flying J. I don't know what the UK equivalent is. And some of the oil majors operate there too, Speedway or Exxon or whatever. And so I did my polling show that I do with these groups. And I was fascinated by the positive response. And somebody from one of the oil majors came over. And I said, I'm going to hear from it now. And he said, no, look, when they come into one of our service stations, we're happy to sell them fuel. But the margin on the fuel is not great. We only make a couple pennies a gallon. Maybe on a highway station, we're making a dime. It's an okay business. What we love to do is sell them the Coca-Cola and the potato chips at 50% margin. So if they're there for 15 minutes on an electric charging unit, we're happy. They're going to buy more stuff. Our problem is we can't get the utilities to put in the electricity. And when they do, they charge us so much, we have to charge 65 cents a charge and everybody hates us. We want to charge 45 and make 3 cents and make it on the potato chips. But they charge us $1 million to trench in the power. It was interesting. But it was kind of an adult corporate thing of, look, what we want is people behind the cash register in the convenience store and the car wash. So tell us how to get there with electric. And, are we happy to spend $500,000 per station on charging units? Of course we are. It's easy. And they're subsidized. Problem's getting the power. So anyway, it was a kind of an eye-opener to me because I thought I'd get get chewed out. We're kind of testing this. And this might be something you edit out, but I'll give you a little sidebar. And I'm going to send you a TV ad we're running, or we're going to run. And it might be a fun video show and tell. I'll send you two. We're doing a pushback television campaign we're about to launch against the refiners. And we're picking Michigan because it's one of the most important states in the presidential election. Remember, in our election, only 5 or 6 states picked the president because they cast all their votes winner take all, essentially. And Michigan, which is number 2 in new EV jobs, over 30,000. By the way, nobody's heard about those jobs, so we're running one ad to make them famous, so they become an election issue, which we think will help EVs. If you're a pro-EV politician, you can surf on that, like Harris. If you're an anti-EV politician like Trump, it'll incentivize you to shut the hell up and move on. So we're launching this campaign in Michigan, explaining why EV jobs are important. And we have another commercial that pushes back against the oil campaign, which is running in the key states. And that's back to what you said earlier about the mandate. So we're trying to take the fight to the voters on all this stuff. So anyway, and I'll send you the commercials if you want them. So sorry for the tangent, but I thought it might be relevant.
No, it definitely is relevant. It was, a brief tangent and one that's definitely relevant. And I think that is the thing that ultimately, if you look at any kind of business, and how do I phrase this without encouraging lots of comments in the podcast comments? But
No, get them. Comments are good. They're engagement. Go for it.
Comments are good. I welcome the comments. Just play nicely in them. But if you
that's hard. But go ahead. They never do. But go ahead. Sorry. Yeah. People, it's interesting. I don't want to go off on another long comment, but there's been some social science research. People are much meaner with the keyboard than they are in real life. It's interesting. There's like an incentive to it because there's no human interaction involved.
And I've had. Generally speaking, I think we are pretty lucky with a fully charged audience because we get some really, really interesting debates, genuinely some comments that I think, yep, I'm going to go away and do a little bit more research. And then occasionally there's the one about, my hair. I think, brilliant. Why did you feel so compelled to write that comment? But anyway, I digress.
Well, old Baldy USA here will take all the heat for you in this episode.
Well, I don't know if people will be able to see them, but there's definitely some more greys appearing, I will say. Anyway, but anyone who's worked in any kind of business will know that how a decision's made, it's made on cost, quality, and time. Mm-hmm. And for anything that has an environmental component, it needs to work within that structure.
Right.
And whether that's kind of a direct structure or an indirect structure or, however it may be, that's how things get done. And I firmly believe that there's a way that acting in the way that's sort of in the best interest of the planet can still fit within that matrix and within that sort of structure. We've already said that let's have a look at EV charging points at petrol stations. Well, you have a greater dwell time. People will be spending more money. But for an individual, they are spending less money on fueling that vehicle or, what have you. So I think It's a long-winded way of saying I agree with you, with a much bigger tangent about comments. But there you go. Okay, something I'm very impressed by is that we have made it approximately 40 minutes into this podcast without mentioning a certain person by the name of Elon Musk.
Yes.
Yes, it's quite a feat, given what we're talking about. But he has entered the chat, let's say, and he has donated to Trump's presidential campaign. How do you think that changes things? Will it change things?
Yeah, I think he's had a bit of a dampening effect on Trump. Elon's polling numbers are amazing. We tested him in our survey. And we asked people, do you agree or disagree? We had a lot of agree or disagree statements, old pollster trick. Excuse me. Sorry, I've been fighting a little throat thing here.
Oh, no, take your time.
I will do that again from the top. So Elon is fascinating, particularly in the polling data, because we tested him. We asked people an agree-disagree statement, which is something we do a lot of in polling. And we said, agree or disagree, Elon Musk is a good ambassador for EVs. Among people who were more pro-EV, more democratic, kind of the pro-EV 40% or so, he was 2-1 not a good ambassador, much more negative than positive. Among people who were more EV skeptical, he was 2-1 positive. Yes, he's a good ambassador. And among Republicans and Democrats, it was even more pronounced. Democrats said, no, we don't like him. Unfavorable rating was high. Not a good ambassador was high. Among Republicans, again, more skeptical about EVs, they were, yeah, he's a great ambassador, 2-1, and he has a pretty good favorable rating. So he has gone from EV Jesus over to Fox News personality, MAGA all the way. Now, people say, oh, my God, what a nightmare for the Tesla marketers. And I think there is some truth in that. And Tesla's market share has dropped. Part of that is more products from non-Tesla people are entering the marketplace. BMW, Mercedes, they're all up significantly for it. But the Elon thing is a problem. In Los Angeles, one of the biggest EV markets in the United States, California is about a 23% EV state now in new car sales. You see bumper stickers, I bought this car before Elon went crazy. Now, but on the other hand, there is a silver lining in it for people who favor electrification. He has rare and powerful brand image with skeptical Republicans, EV skeptical. He could be Nixon to China. He could open some Republican minds to EVs, should he choose to. And getting him to focus and choose to is not an easy task. He tends to have a lot of different interests and ricochet around between them. But I think there's value there if it could be harnessed. Because again, the idea is not to demonize the people who, quote, don't get it on EVs. The idea is to convert them. And Elon could be a powerful weapon in that work.
Yeah, it's so... And, I'm totally not surprised by the results that you had to that agree or disagree question, because we really see it on our own channel, for example, that there is definite consensus that without Elon Musk, the EV industry would not be where it is, and that Tesla is so critically important to the EV industry. On the other hand, there is this real kind of, anytime we talk about Tesla, it's, I can't believe you're giving, a platform to characters like Elon Musk. So we're like, well, right. We can't really win, but also we can't sort of ignore this major piece of the EV puzzle.
Well, it's just a perfect example of how the loading of politics gets in the way of what ought to be a non-political discussion.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question then. You are a conservative, but I'm going to ask you to be neutral for a second, because that is, again, your intention with this whole project.
I might hurt myself, but I will try. I'm what we Americans call a right-wing nut, but go ahead.
What would your advice be to Kamala Harris? Because she is yet to choose her running mate, and I was reading some articles about who are the potential people that it could be. And there's this definite feeling of, well, maybe, a strategic move, for example, would be that she chooses someone who isn't so pro-environment or has such a kind of sustainability agenda, and that might make her have a bit more of a wider appeal. She's also been a huge supporter of the Inflation Reduction Act, but she's been a bit more vocal, before she became vice president, on certain environmental issues, for example, fracking, than, say, Joe Biden has. So in the context of all of that, what would your advice be to her under the guise of keeping the EV agenda alive?
Well, she's doing very well. You know, the Democrats were so down in the dumps over Biden, who looked to be a certain loser against the hated Donald Trump from their point of view, that when Biden heroically, by the way, not a lot of politicians ever do this, stepped aside, there was this explosion of good feeling, like a vast tornado that literally picked her up like a barn and has moved her 100 miles across the country at 300 feet. But the barn is going to land. And then the general election begins, because a lot of this whirlwind is tremendous passion, which is a good thing for the Democrats inside their party. Now we got to go on to the general election. So I would give her the same advice on, and I have briefed some Democratic polls on this with our data, and we're doing more data. Talk about EV jobs. The Democrats made a mistake when they wanted to always talk about green jobs, because half the country only heard green. And they interpreted it as that, oh, they're going to put me out of work at the aluminum factory and they're going to make me go make windmills or something. And I don't want to be forced. I don't want to be told. I don't believe it. I don't want to go back to school at 55 to learn about coding computers for solar energy. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Particularly in those states. This election will be decided by Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, and maybe, without getting into a crazy tangent, one congressional district in Nebraska around Omaha, because that state is different in how they do their electoral. Why? I don't know. Maine and Nebraska have their own way. So if she can win the Nebraska district, which is 50-50, in an otherwise red state, it's the Democrat part of the state, Omaha, the city, she can win Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, manufacturing jobs, metal bending jobs. In those states with that argument, I mean, nobody knows there are 30,000 brand new manufacturing jobs in Michigan. I've done 3 successful governor campaigns in the state of Michigan. Michigan politics is about manufacturing. It's the Midlands, as you would say in the UK. And good manufacturing jobs resonate tremendously because they've got families that have been built on 3 generations of those kind of. They don't want to learn how to code computers. They're not going to become social workers or yoga instructors. They want to bend metal and do what they know how to do, which is what their parents did. The fact that those jobs are in service of a green output is great, but don't let that get in the way of being a job they can understand and vote in favor of. So I would take it to meat and potatoes jobs. I would watch the left-wing environmental dogma to win an election in those states. Now, what you have to remember, her political problem is when she ran for president in 2019 and 2020 early primaries, campaign was a disaster, and she ran to the left of Joe Biden. So that Kamala Harris should not be in what in politics here we call in the pet store window. You know, you don't put the snakes in the window, you put the cute puppies, so to speak. And I'm against puppy mills. Don't send me letters. I get it. But the analogy is sell the stuff that works. And EV jobs are a great issue that nobody's run with, by the way. That's why we're running this ad in Michigan. We're trying to create an environment where politicians of both parties can be for EVs and profit from it politically. We're trying to make those jobs famous in Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Right now, and this is kind of geeky American electioneering stuff, so bear with me, but 68%, 2/3 of the electoral college votes that will pick the president in the swing states, 2/3 of those votes come from states with massive EV manufacturing investment. So that is a great path to victory for politicians smart enough to work with it. And we're trying what we can do as a nonpartisan organization that doesn't pick candidates. We're trying to help catalyze that to give the politicians a route forward on EVs in both parties.
Thank you so much to Mike for joining us for this podcast. Thank you to Louis from our team who will be editing this podcast. And thank you to you. Before you go, if I could ask one teeny tiny favour, if you could give this episode a like, a comment or a subscribe or share it with a friend or all of the above, it is so enormously appreciated. It makes sure that we can keep on sharing all of the cool and super important stuff in this clean energy and electric vehicle transition. But that's it. If you have been, thank you for listening.